In an address at the forum, proceedings from which were carried in an article in the Express on December 15th, Dr. Joth Singh asserted that there must be a balance between development and the environment. Dr. Singh is the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Environmental Management Authority. Dr. Singh, thanks for talking with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, first of all, the article didn't say what the forum was about and under what auspices it was held. Help us with that.
Well, I think this issue has been discussed at different fora. Certainly, one dealing with the energy sector and building the energy sector in Trinidad and Tobago. There are usual comments with regards to the impact of environmental considerations on the industry. So that would have been one. Yeah. Certainly, another would have been an EMA organized forum where we have been sharing information with regards to issues related to sustainable development, where environment, of course, features very heavily. So it is a point of discussion, and I think something which probably needs to be ventilated a lot more.
All right. And as a purpose of a discussion such as this, you say that the EMA does not see as a trade-off the issue about development versus the environment. Why do you have to make that statement?
Because I think it is often expressed that environment is an obstacle, and environmental considerations would introduce obstacles to the development path. But certainly, if you understand the concepts associated with sustainable development, it speaks to development which takes into consideration the environment. And indeed, if you link issues related to quality of life to development, not just economic growth, you would quickly recognize that environmental quality is an important component to quality of life. So this is why, the EMA has been sharing information, and it's not something that we are inventing. It is something which is widely accepted internationally, that environment and development need to work hand in hand, and indeed contributes to the notion of sustainable development, which our government has spoken to in terms of a platform.
So it's committed to.
It is committed to sustainable development, and therefore, by an understanding of the philosophy of sustainable development, committed to development in consideration of environmental issues.
All right. I'm paraphrasing something you say in the piece here. Any developer wanting to do business in Trinidad and Tobago should be aware of the environmental requirements. What are some of those essential requirements?
Well, one certainly of relevance to development is the need for a certificate of environmental clearance from the Environmental Management Authority. And that was introduced in legislation in 2001, recognizing, of course, that in the past, we have had development projects which did not take into consideration issues related to the environment. We have had an entire Point Lisas industrial estate, for example, where although there are regulations in place with the owner of the estate or the management of the estate, there were no stated legislation requiring environmental consideration. So this certainly is one where if you are now coming into Trinidad, and this is post-2001, and intend on engaging in development projects, you may be subjected to the need for a certificate of environmental clearance. Now that is guided by, I mentioned the CEC rules, as we call them, Certificate of Environmental Clearance rules. But annexed to that is a schedule of activities, and there are 44 activities which have been identified which would require consideration by the EMA. So indeed, when you come into Trinidad, you're engaging in a development project. You require clearance, of course, from the ministry dealing with the economy. You need clearance from the Ministry of Finance. You need clearance from the Town and Country Planning Division. And you need clearance from the Environmental Management Authority.
Yeah. You say annexed to the CEC this 44-point agenda, if you like. Mm-hmm. So what exactly is the CEC then?
Well, the CEC is a Certificate of Environmental Clearance. And that is made legal, if you will, by what we call the CEC rules. It is subsidiary legislation which has been passed under the Environmental Management Act. But to specify exactly what the CEC rules will be referring to, you have this list of designated activities which have been identified. So these 44 activities have been identified, and they include things like wastewater treatment plants, water distribution systems, poultry farming, land clearing activities. So a variety of activities actually have been identified. And so, when a developer comes in, he would examine that list and see whether the development is falling under that category. and then he would need to approach the EMA to get clearance. So that is actually made active by this subsidiary legislation, which we call the CC rules.
All right. And part of the process that you talk about in arriving at, making an assessment for a certificate of environmental clearance is the process which allows for public comment.
Correct.
Could people just say, no, we don't want this or that plant in our area, and that objection would be upheld, or they must prove that the objection is based on something?
Well, there must be some significance to that objection, and so the EMA will engage in a very elaborate process of ensuring that the sentiment and views of the community, especially affected communities in the nearby area, would be taken into consideration. So part of the process would usually require public meetings in that area and harnessing the comments from the communities. Now, sometimes if it's a very simple application, it doesn't have to be a public meeting, but there has to be a mechanism where the public is consulted and their views taken on board. No, you have circumstances where the community may just be voicing, objection to a development, and there is no substance. Basically, we just don't want it. And then in that circumstance, the EMA would examine it, ensure that the information is shared with them so that they as well recognize that there are no impacts in a circumstance like that. So it is taken into consideration, but if a simple objection by a community against a project may not necessarily lead to the project being...
Right. So a CEC can be granted in the face of people's objections if those objections aren't grounded in some environmental realities.
Correct. That is correct.
Yeah. Okay. You say that the EMA, you refer to what you call mature regulatory systems, such as those existing in Canada and the United States. Mm-hmm. Describe, if you will, what such a process looks like, a mature system.
Well, there are several. Certainly Canada, United States, and Europe, there are many very mature environmental legislation and agencies given that responsibility. A very detailed process, similar to what we are utilizing in Trinidad, where, a development project is looked at, it is determined whether an environmental type clearance is given, and it's called a different name in different places. An agency would investigate through its legislation, and you would go through this very elaborate process. Now, in some cases, so you start with an application. The application is examined, then, the agency would ask you for information surrounding that project. You would provide that information. The agency will then make an assessment as to whether it is sufficient. If it is not sufficient, and usually, this is about getting information to make a decision. If it is insufficient, you may be asked to provide that information through a variety of ways. One is maybe through the conduct of an environmental impact assessment. And that environmental impact assessment can sometimes take, in instances in Europe and in Canada, maybe up to 2 years. So, when we refer to a mature process, this is a matter of rhythm in the development sector, that any agency, any development which has to take place would know and recognize that this is part and parcel of the equation and is not seen as an obstacle as it is seen sometimes in Trinidad and Tobago. Yeah. So a developer will cater for the requirements of an environmental clearance.
Where would you say we are on the scale of being an immature province, to use a term, and one that is mature?
Well, I would say that we are somewhere in between there. Certainly, I think we have reasonably mature legislation. And I think the government of Trinidad and Tobago has been very proactive in that sense. And I also believe in recognition that we are developing, we are an industrial state, and therefore subject to the impacts on the environment in a significant way. So I think our legislation is quite good. There are certainly areas where it can be improved, and I think as we mature, the legislation will be refined. And we have been applying now the CC rules since 2001. So, we have learned a fair amount from the process of applying the legislation. We have recognized that there are certain aspects of it which would need to be tuned to make it much more effective. And from the perspective in terms of the processing, because one of the issues with development projects and developers is that they wish to have it done within a very short period of time. So the EMA has recognized that it needs to make its process much more efficient. And, we are well on the way to getting to that point. I would say we are 90% there, if not, a higher percentage in terms of efficiency. And that is important in terms of maturity, because certainly you don't want to be in a circumstance where you're imposing a requirement which is way too lengthy, and then it throws out entirely, the issue with regards to timelines which a development project would need to meet. So I think we are significantly advanced in that perspective. So
no, I think 90 is an interesting number, because you say we are 90% there, but you refer to the Canadian process, which in which you say that it takes up to 90 days to determine whether a comprehensive environmental assessment has to take place.
Correct.
So 90 days is a critical.
Yeah, and in the case, and if you compare that with the Trinidad and Tobago legislation, we have maybe 30 days to make that determination. So, there's, of course, timelines which are included in the legislation itself that the EMA has to meet. So they have a very...
So what accounts for the difference? I mean, you're talking about a month as opposed to 3 months.
Yeah. Well, I think they have allowed for, more or deeper consideration. Whereas, in our own legislation, we take into consideration the timelines that a developer may be working with. So, we try to keep it as short as possible. Now, the EMA also has an opportunity, beyond that 30-day timeline, to say that, okay, well, we really are uncertain at this point in time because you have provided us with very limited information. So we will request further information. And when we request that further information, it gives us another 30 days to make that determination as to, ultimately whether you need to do an environmental impact assessment. But usually we would, be able to operate within that timeline. So, if you're comparing with the legislative framework and the way it is applied in a developed country, such as Canada and even the United States, you find that they have greater or longer timelines in order to make those decisions. And, a developer would be aware of these timelines. And so when he's, working out his flow with regards to times of the development, he's putting that into the equation. And what happens in Trinidad and Tobago is that it appears that certainly new people coming in to do business here. And of course, part of what might be attractive in Trinidad and Tobago, outside of our very cheap energy, is an environment where government is trying to encourage business, as rapidly as possible. So, they would basically say, well, this thing is slowing me down. I don't have time to do this. Why don't we try and bypass that in some way? And the EMA would, then be criticized, and I think unreasonably so, for taking time to do its work. These things are not done overnight. Issues related to the environment require deep consideration. As you mentioned, the issue with regards to the view of the public, they have to have an opportunity to comment, and therefore, when an application comes into the EMA and we start the processing, we would say, okay, you need a certain amount of time for the public to be consulted so that we understand their view. And that doesn't happen in 2 days, So there are time requirements when you engage in processing.
And sometimes when you get criticized on the other side for or seeming to be too lenient in the granting of a CC.
And that is another issue that Trinidad and Tobago we are developing very strong advocates on the environment. I think Trinidad is maturing in that sense as well, and that's good for Trinidad and Tobago. I think in the past, you would have organizations who would basically just criticize without any reason. Now I think we have very strong lobby groups, and they are well equipped with a level of expertise which will challenge the EMA as well. So that is the other side of the equation, where you have to take that into consideration, where the EMA has to be on its toes in terms of making the right decision. And certainly, what we cannot forget is the Alutrint example, where the EMA actually processed a CC over 2 years, made a decision to award, and then it was overturned in the High Court because the lobby group says, well, you have made certain errors. So, clearly in a Trinidad and Tobago context, recognizing that it is a legislative platform, this is not we're doing it because we want to and, we have the option not to. It is required by legislation, and therefore we have to go through that process. And it has to be a very thorough one, because it's not only the person coming in to do business, it is the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago who are very concerned about their environment, and rightfully so.
All right. I want to come back to Alutrint in a way, and because it was one of 3 or 4 of the major issues over the last couple of years in which there were these challenges against developers on the issue of environmental impact. But let me paraphrase again from what you say. The CEC process is intended to protect the environment by facilitating interaction between the applicant, the public, the relevant authorities, and ensuring that all possible impacts on human health and the environment are considered and avoided or minimized to acceptable levels when development projects are initiated. And that essentially is at the heart of your remit.
That is very much the heart of the remit of the EMA, to ensure that all those things are done. Because we are talking about, public health issues, human health issues, other than, what might be seen as traditional and environmental issues, all linked, of course, to the well-being of people living in a country where development is occurring rapidly. So it is to me, a centerpiece. It is not a luxury, because some people view it as a luxury. These guys are concerned about the environment, so let's entertain them. It is a centerpiece to our development. We have to protect the well-being of our citizens.
All right, you Trent. That's the library development.
Yeah.
You had Chatham before that, and after that, sometime alongside with that, you had the anxiety over the rapid rail, and then you had the SS Steel, the proposed SS Steel plant in Claxton Bay. What are some of the lessons you think we should have learned, or in fact learned, through these processes as they related to people's concerns and agitation about environmental impact?
Certainly, one that stands out in my own mind is the issue of consulting with the public, because certainly it was one of the issues identified by the learned judge in overruling and overturning and quashing the EMA's decision to award a CC for the Alutrin development. It was stated that the public was not sufficiently consulted, and therefore in that judgment there's now a requirement for the EMA to ensure that that process is fully explored. I think one of the significant lessons learned. One of the other issues which we now have to give due consideration to is what we call cumulative impact. Because, while the current arrangement with regards to the legislation allows for consideration of individual projects, side by side, each project is considered separately. And I think it's one of the things that we can mature and do better going forward. Because I think we need to look strategically at projects and developments, for example, across an industrial estate. So one of the lessons learned is the issue of cumulative impact. And again, one of the rulings in the Alutrin decision, that the issue of cumulative impact was not sufficiently considered, that you have many different factors when you make a decision, and it's not simply that factor that you're looking at, it is everything else that is surrounding, and I think significant as well. You mentioned the Claxton Bay Development Project, which was a port application, an application for a port. The EMA turned down that application, saying that we did not have the information that we required to make a decision in favor of the development. And I think it's a very strong lesson for developers that please don't come and believe that this is a project which has the support on an economic front in Trinidad and Tobago.
It'll create jobs and it'll
create jobs, etc.
That's not all.
That gives you permission then to not thoroughly ventilate and investigate the environmental impacts, that you will get away with it. Because, many developers believe that they can, there's strong support.
Because they're spending a lot of money.
Because they're spending a lot of money, they're creating jobs, But, I think that was a very strong signal which was sent as well, that although this may have the support on an economic front, if the environmental components are neglected, that you will not get the permission to go ahead. And I think, hopefully, a signal which developers would have noted.
I wanted to ask you about the level of awareness that you referred to earlier in the country already on this question of the need for proper assessments of environmental impacts and the whole process of acquiring a CEC. But personally, are you surprised by the level of awareness, by the level of information and expertise, if you like, among people in the population, particularly the frontline lobbyists, on this question of environmental impact and the need to point things out?
I'm not really surprised. I'm very impressed. I think, it means that we have a very mature group of people who are, and again, the process, it started off with a very simplistic approach, where, you start off with identifying the problem and speak about the problem. I think we have groups now who are identifying possible solutions. And I think that is very, very positive for Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm very impressed. It speaks in the main to the larger projects which have been occurring in Trinidad and Tobago. But the EMA also covers very small development projects. I mean, the EMA would also cover, for example, a spray painting operation, where you need a clearance from the EMA to do that. And we feel that there is still insufficient understanding from people who wish to engage in that aspect of development work, where they would set up a spray paint operation within a residential area and all the impacts that are associated with that. And the EMA is sometimes challenged to deal with that. Because again, you're dealing with two issues. One, you're dealing with the environmental implications, and you're dealing with somebody who's trying to make a living. And, trying to balance those two things sometimes falls very squarely on the EMA's laps to make those decisions. So I think in some ways, we are demonstrating signs of maturing in terms of the strong advocacy which is now ensuing in Trinidad and Tobago. And on the other hand, and on the other side, you have sometimes a lack of thorough understanding as to what is required for smaller operators to get involved in business and to do it in such a way that you're not impacting on residents in the area.
All right. You mentioned the fact that the Ayutrint issue was determined in the High Court. Why not at the Environmental Commission, where there's an environmental court?
Yeah. Well, I think the legislation really requires, the way it is set up is that, the High Court really needs to investigate issues related to questions with regards to that level of decision, and that the Commission doesn't really have the authority at this point in time to engage in that level of ruling, so that the decisions of that nature taken by the EMA, where it brings into question an entire process, really has to be investigated on a High Court level. Indeed, as you might know, the EMA at some time in the past had appealed that decision of the High Court, and it went to the Court of Appeal. But my current board indicated that when they looked at it, they felt that they were satisfied, and therefore it stopped at that point. But that is the process that is available to ensure that the legislative mechanisms available in Trinidad and Tobago are brought to bear on decisions that are that significant. And of course, you recognize that the Ayutrint project was a significant project.
Right. And when you refer to the need for stronger legislation in some areas, you think that the legislation will then give more teeth to the Environmental Commission, and therefore those matters such as that will then go to the Environmental Court?
I think certainly that needs to be considered. I think the Environmental Commission certainly would argue that they can do much more. And I think the EMA certainly can support that as well. Because you have this separate mechanism which has been established to look into environmental issues in the context of sustainable development again. So yes, that would receive the EMA's support, and certainly would quicken the pace in terms of getting any queries or challenges for any issue, not only EMA decisions, but issues which may require the attention of a legal intervention. So I think the Commission can be better utilized, and certainly the legislation would need to be tweaked to make that happen.
All right, going back to the level of environmental impact lobbying and lobbying awareness in the country. I remember the former Prime Minister, saying that on more than one occasion that he thought that the environmental lobby in places like the United States was too strong, indicating therefore that he was going to somehow checkmate it in Trinidad and Tobago. What is the balance that has to be struck, though? And you believe that there could be a situation in which in Trinidad and Tobago such a lobby could become too strong and therefore act as a deterrent to development and investment in the industry?
That is not my view. I think we have an awareness growing in our population, and I think that is very positive. I think people are understanding their rights, and certainly environmental rights are part and parcel of that. I think we have a very positive and unique construct in Trinidad and Tobago in the Environmental Management Authority. I think very unusual in the context of other agencies that operate, where the EMA has the ability to make a decision which can positively or negatively impact on a project or plans for a project. And I think that is very positive. It takes away, sometimes the politics of making decisions, and you have a technically sound organization which has been given the responsibility of guiding these types of development. And I think that's very positive. I think we have seen signs elsewhere in terms of decision making where it doesn't work when you have it otherwise. I mean, we have seen in recent times, for example, that development in certain areas in Trinidad and Tobago should not have occurred, and we are suffering the impacts, including flooding, which we witnessed, some months ago. And so I think it's a very positive thing, and I would want us to build on it rather than step away from it. I know, in the past, consideration has been given to remove some of the authority from the EMA.
Yeah, when you talk about taking away 150 hectares of land
Well,
somewhere.
that certainly is one good example,
Yeah.
of where the EMA's legislation was modified. And, we are suffering the consequences of that. The landscape is scarred with quarries which are not being regulated. And so, if we have to learn something from that very bad experience, let us learn that you have an organization which can control that and spare us the impact that we are witnessing. And any move to deregulate, I think, would be a mistake. If there is a lobby coming from outside for us to simplify our process, and by so doing compromise the environment, I think we are being regressive and going backwards, and we certainly should move forward as a country.
All right, let me quote you as we come to the end of this discussion. Whilst we are all anxious to inject investment into the economy, we must not appear to be pressured by developers. But my question, quite apart from appearances, does the EMA continue to feel pressure by developers?
We do, and that is part of the reality of our Environmental Management Authority, where we are constantly asked to make a decision within a very short period of time, or not consider certain things. But we always go back to our legislation and say we are mandated by law. This organization was set up to ensure that the environment is considered in the context of sustainable development. It's not a preservation organization. It is an organization set up to manage the environment, and we will do that to the best of our ability. And so please provide us with what we need to make a good decision, because we are looking to protect country and citizen.
Dr. Joth Singh, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Environmental Management Authority. Thank you very much.
Thank you.